So we are here to perform the Azure AD integration with AKS so that we could finally deploy the Azure AD-enabled AKS cluster, and then we'll create a RBAC role inside the cluster and provide permissions. Everything that we have discussed in the previous video, we are going to perform here. So let's open the Cloud Shell to perform this demonstration. And hold on, wait a minute. I think Cloud Shell is a great tool. It's quite handy while performing these kind of demonstration or work, but this is not good for the beginners. If I go and copy and paste the commands here, it will keep on happening at the back end, but nobody can see like what is happening. So let's use the Azure portal. Okay, if you remember, the very first part was the prerequisite for AKS and Azure AD, and that prerequisite was, if you remember, you can guess, server and client applications. I just paused because if you have watched my previous video, you knew there are like two applications we deploy so that we could actually expose the API, do the consent and grant the permissions, and that's the reason AKS can go ahead and talk to the Azure AD for the authentication purpose in a layman language, but this is covered in the previous video. So let's go ahead and create all these things. Go to Azure Active Directory. First, we are creating the server application. Okay. So we need to go and click on app registration and then new registration. Now here you need to provide any name for your server application. I'm doing it AKS Azure AD server. Here we are giving the directory only in this operation, and we have to provide the URI right here, redirect URI, with something like HTTPS. You can use it. I'm using AKS Azure AD server with the same name. It would be easy to track, and it's good for the demonstration purpose. But you know what I'm trying to do? You're just registering the application with a name. Okay, let's select the register. Now, once the application registered, we need to go to the manifest file. This is the JSON file you can see, and group membership claims, we need to make it all. So that's how the JSON works, with two quotes, all, and save it. Okay, so it will help us. We can give the permissions to the users and the groups as well. Now the manifest file is done, then we need to go ahead and create the secrets. Okay, and meanwhile, while I create it, let me open my notepad so that I'll keep copy. Okay, we need to give it give a name. Okay, you can give any name that you want. I'm using the same pattern that I was using, AKS Azure AD server, for 1 year. Okay, add it. You need to copy this value for the secret because this is you're going to use when you'll deploy your AKS cluster. Okay, so you need to keep it, and then we need to go and do some openings or delegate the permissions in the API. So click on API permissions at the left side and click on add a permission. Okay, now, and under add the permission, there's this box, this window appears, and click on Microsoft Graph. Okay, and we need to delegate the permissions. Click here. Now a lot of different kind of permissions appear. we need to delegate directory read all permission first. So you need to come and go to directory and read all. Okay. Now user permission read all, you need to check if it has already been checked or not. If not, you need to check it by yourself. It has already been checked. Okay. And then we need to select application permissions and then select directory read all permissions. Directory read all permissions. Okay. And we need to add the permissions. So you can see here with the help of Microsoft Graph or Azure AD, we are delegating read all permissions and we'll do the consent. Okay. And user read permission was already there. So let's give it a consent. You see that? It is there. Now we have provided the consent that it can read all application and user data. Okay. Now we need to expose an API. To do that, we need to add a scope. Now this is the application ID that we have created right here. Okay, that is we are going to expose. We need to provide a scope name. Okay, you can provide any name that you want, but you keep a note of that always. And it's always a best practice to use the same kind of thing that would remind you. So I'm using that, AKS Azure AD Server. Okay, and add a scope. So here we are exposing permissions. So this will help us to actually perform the authentication through Azure AD for AKS. If we are not able to grasp what is happening, once the task is completed and we'll summarize everything, you would able to understand what we did. And if you rewatch the video, everything will fall in place. Okay. Now under the overview, we have this application ID. This is what we have added in the scope or the consent we have given, right? So you need to keep the copy of this application ID because you got to use it when you will be deploying the AKS cluster or Azure AD-enabled AKS cluster. So this part is done. So what we have done till now, we have created an application or the first component of the prerequisite, which is server application. To do that, we went on Azure AD, registered the application, and in the manifest file, we'll edit the group membership claims to all. And then we created a secret, right? And then we added the API permissions. We added directory read all, user read, and application read all permissions, and we'll grant the consent and then exposes the API. Now it's time to create the client application. So what we need to do, we need to go back, click on new registration. Now I was giving AKS Azure Server. Now I'm gonna give the name Azure AD Client. Okay, same option, and here we need to use HTTPS URI. I'm using just as the name. Let's register this. Okay, now go back to API permissions again. Now here we need to add permissions for the client. Okay, under my APIs, here is our first server component We need to select this. We need to select delegate permissions and highlight this and add the permissions. Okay, the first server application that we exposed, API. Our second application, we are delegating the permission to this one. Okay. Now under grant admin consent for default directory, I'm doing it. Okay, it's done. Now we need to select the authentication and we need to select treat application as a public client required for the use of the following flows where redirect array is not used. Yes. Okay. And then save it. So these two things will help to integrate Azure AD with AKS. What exactly is happening with these two applications, as I have already explained to you in the previous video, what would happen, the first application server component, this will provide the user authentication, and the client component is used when there is a prompt for the authentication by the CLI. This client application uses the server application for the actual authentication for the credentials provided by the client. Okay, cool. So this part is completed. So what we need the application ID, right? We need to provide these information in the AKS cluster creation. That's why you need to keep this handy, and then the tenant ID. Tenant is your directory, default directory, that would be tenant ID. All right, so this information I have copied already. If you are following with me, you can do the same. Okay, now the prerequisite is done. So what was the second part? Deploy the AD-enabled cluster. For that part, we need CLI, of course, because that is still not there in the Azure portal. That's why I have to use it. So what we need to do, we first need to create a resource group. Okay, so I'm pasting this command, az group create, name my resource group in the location East US. This will create the resource group, and then let me copy this command from here so that it will help us creating Azure AD-enabled cluster. And rather than typing long credentials or long application IDs, let me paste these. Yes. Okay. Now my resource group has been deployed. Now we need to do az AKS create. Right. That's how we create the AKS cluster with the help of az CLI. Okay. So az AKS create. Right. This will create the AKS cluster with, okay, this will not work, resource group. What is the resource group? My resource group that we have created right here. resource group, my resource group. Okay, cool. Now we need to generate SSH keys, right? And then we need that information that we have been working for, right? AAD server app ID. There would be I need to copy it and paste it here, right? And then AAD application client secret, right? When we created the first application, we also created the secret, if you remember. Then we need the client app ID. We do not created the secret for the client app ID. Okay, we only created the application and add the permissions or delegate the permissions for the server applications. But where all this will go with the tenant ID will not go outside the tenant. So tenant ID. Okay. So that's how we create the Azure AD-enabled AKS cluster. It says AZ AKS create in this resource group with the keys, and this is the server ID with the secret. Now AKS would have the server application integrated with it and the secret so that it can authenticate, and client ID information so that when user will log in, client ID will help in the prompt and go get the authentication from the server application, right? And inside the tenant, this one. All right, so all the information is there. Let's hit enter. Hopefully, if okay, we did some mistake, and as I always say, it is good to do mistakes that would help you learn, right? Of course. So let's try do this. I knew what was a mistake. I didn't give the space, right? It's working now, and as soon as it is completed, we'll try to log in and create a RBAC role for one user. While it is creating, I can show you under my directory, default directory, I have created one user as a AKS. AKS, this is the UPN for my user, because we need to create one manifest file which will provide the RBAC role access to this user, and this is the user principal name you can see, right? And the manifest file we already know that will help us to deploy the deployment, or it's a YAML file, okay? And in our case, it would be a simple YAML file with a kind cluster role binding, because we will create a cluster admin role with our own name. Let's suppose let's use the Microsoft's default Contoso cluster admin and the kind cluster role and name the cluster admin. We'll give this user that access so that when we create or when we try to log in with AKS, it will go and talk to Azure AD, authenticate itself, and come back and grab that role or the permissions which is defined in that role, right? So let's wait while it's completed. All right, so it's been deployed. Will all the default information This is the pod sider, this is the server sider, service sider, load balancer, and the maximum agent pools 10, but we have 3 uh, nodes running, maximum pods 110, count 3. Okay, so this is deployed with the default configuration, because we are here learning the integration of Azure AD. And so let's go ahead and clear this out, and now let's go ahead and log in as an admin. So we do AZ AKS get credentials. That's what we do. That's what we talked about in the previous video, so that the kubeconfig file would provide us all the information. This is the name of our cluster. Okay. If I come here now, if I go here, Kubernetes Service, my AKS cluster, sweet, as an admin. Okay, so we logged in as an admin. Now what we need to do, we need to create RBAC for AD user. Okay, if I do kubectl get nodes, I would have 3 nodes running, and it would not prompt for any Azure AD authentication, because we have not provided any RBAC for Azure AD user. This is logged in as an admin. If you have seen that consent video of ours, context video of this reason, even in AKS, the particular access videos. Okay, so let's go ahead and create RBAC AD user YAML. You can give any name that you want. Okay, so let's do this. And this is what the manifest file, and I'm borrowing all this documentation from the Microsoft. I'll share the link in the description box if you want to go and have a good read and perform this demonstration step by step. So you can see this is the API version. What kind? It's a cluster role binding. That's why it's Contoso, because it's a Microsoft documentation. We are giving the Contoso cluster admin name for this RBAC role, and it's a cluster role, cluster admin. Okay, and our user to whom we are assigning this is AKS user that I have shown you in the Azure AD. So this user would have the admin role, a cluster admin role. Okay, if I do cat RBAC YAML, everything is intact. Okay, now what we need to do, we need to deploy this, right? We need to kubectl and apply this so that it will create this. Now it's been created. Now what we can do, we can go ahead and try to get the credentials. Okay, if I do that, okay, let me clear this out and do kubectl get pods. You see, it's asking to sign in. Use a web browser to open the page and use this code. Let me copy the code. I'm sorry. Let me copy this code. Go here and paste it. Next. See, this is Azure AD who is authenticating now. Let's do the AKS. Skip. We are signed in AKS Azure AD client application on your device. Come here and do kubectl get pods. Okay, we just hit this, so let's do again. Okay. All right. So we are authenticated now. If I do pods, no resource found in default namespace because there is no pod, but there are nodes, of course, right? Now I'm logged in as an AKS. AKS is the username, and he got authenticated from this https microsoft.com device login because it is integrated with Azure AD, right? Very good. Now, if it's a cluster role binding, right? If I try kubectl get cluster role binding, oh, there is a spelling mistake. I think the B cluster role binding. So these all are the cluster role bindings, and here is the one Contoso cluster admin that we have created. If you want, you can go ahead and do kubectl describe this role. This is what we have created. Okay, what is this error? I must have done something wrong, so let me quickly check that. Okay, so we just need to describe cluster role binding with this name that we have created. That was the command mistake I did. So if I do that, this is what it is. This is the user AKS who has this permissions, okay? Cluster admin, cluster role with cluster admin permissions. This is what we have created. And if you do this cat YAML, you'll see it's a cluster role binding. It was not a cluster role, it was cluster role binding. So cluster role was cluster admin that we have binded with this user. We described and everything is here. So that's how we integrate Azure AD with AKS and utilize the functionality of authentication authorization. Well, thank you for watching and you have a good day. Bye-bye.